On the afternoon of August 16th, 1944, at exactly 4 o'clock, General Paul Hausser stood inside an old farmhouse near Trun, France, staring at a map that carried the fate of 50,000 men. On that thin sheet of paper were not just roads and symbols, but lives balanced on the edge of erasure. One of his senior staff officers had just finished marking Allied positions in red pencil. To the south, American forces had pushed 15 kilometers past Argentan. To the north, Canadian troops were driving down from Falaise. Between them stretched a narrow corridor, 18 kilometers wide, shrinking hour by hour like a tightening noose. Inside it stood the entire German 7th Army, 50,000 soldiers, 300 tanks, and thousands of vehicles packed onto 3 narrow roads leading east. But the map was not what made Hausser's hands feel heavy. 15 minutes earlier, a message had arrived from Führer headquarters, stamped urgently in red, the color of blood and absolute authority. The order was blunt and final. Hold current positions, no withdrawal authorized, continue preparations for counterattack. There was no room for debate, and no space for mercy. The question raised by this story seems simple, yet its answer is extraordinary. One day earlier, by August 15th, Hausser had begun quietly allowing limited withdrawals, carefully describing them as tactical repositioning rather than open retreat. While Hitler demanded that the 7th Army stand fast and wait for destruction, Hausser issued what he carefully called tactical repositioning orders. Every German officer knew exactly what those words meant. They meant withdrawal now, before the Allied trap closed completely. Hausser had disobeyed Hitler, and that decision, combined with Allied delays and battlefield chaos, helped allow roughly 20,000 German soldiers to escape destruction or capture. The mathematics behind this gamble were brutal and clear. Canadian forces under General Harry Crerar were steadily advancing from the north, while American forces under General George Patton were pushing northward from the south, causing the gap to shrink day by day. At that pace, the corridor would disappear in 5 to 7 days, trapping 50,000 men with no escape, no supplies, and no future. 6 days earlier, on August 12th, when the gap was still 25 kilometers wide and an organized withdrawal was still possible, Hausser had sent his first formal request to Field Marshal Walter Model. His message was precise and cold. The 7th Army's situation was critical, the gap was closing rapidly, and without authorization within 24 hours, preserving combat strength would become mathematically impossible. Hitler's reply was immediate and absolute. Hold positions, withdrawal not authorized. What followed between August 12th and August 20th, 1944, became one of the most controversial command decisions made by any German general in World War II. It left behind a question that still echoes through military academies today. When does a commander's duty to save his army outweigh his duty to obey supreme orders? The trap at Falaise did not spring shut overnight. It had been closing for days, and everyone except Hitler seemed to understand what was happening. About 10 days before Hausser stood studying that map on August 16th, Hitler had ordered Operation Lüttich, a desperate counterattack launched on August 7th and designed to cut through Patton's advancing columns and split the Allied armies. The attack failed within 48 hours, spending German armored strength for no gain, but Hitler refused withdrawal orders. As Patton and Montgomery's forces began closing from north and south like the jaws of a vice, German commanders found themselves trapped between two armies with the Führer forbidding retreat. On the night of August 7th to 8th, the Allies launched Operation Totalize, and by August 12th any remaining doubt about Allied intentions had vanished as the offensive gained momentum, and any remaining doubt about Allied intentions vanished. Canadian and Polish forces pushed toward Falaise from the north. The American Third Army advanced toward Argentan from the south. While both columns were advancing towards the same general area, their objectives were not identical, because Patton's forces were ordered to stop at Argentan while Canadian and Polish units continued pushing south toward Falaise. When Hausser received his first situation reports on August 14th, he would have understood immediately what the red marks on his map meant. The gap between Falaise and Argentan measured 25 kilometers. If Allied advance rates held steady, the corridor would close in less than a week. The logistics of evacuating 50,000 men through that narrowing gap were brutal. 300 tanks, including Panthers and Panzer IV with full ammunition loads. Thousands of vehicles from half-tracks to fuel tankers. Critical equipment including radio stations, medical supplies, field hospitals. All moving across roads already choked with traffic, bombed continuously by Allied aircraft operating in waves of 20 to 40 fighters every 30 minutes, and under constant artillery fire from Allied batteries with clear observation of every escape route. The roads through Trône, Chambois, and Saint-Lambert could handle approximately 300 to 400 vehicles per hour in daylight under perfect conditions. In darkness, with wreckage blocking routes and bridge approaches destroyed, actual capacity dropped to perhaps 150 vehicles per hour. Moving 50,000 men and their equipment would require 14 to 20 hours of uninterrupted movement. But the Allies would not grant 14 uninterrupted minutes, and every hour brought the steel jaws closer together. That evening on August 14th, a senior staff officer marked the Allied positions on the map, reflecting the growing realization among German commanders of the danger they faced, and the two men would have recognized what those marks represented. Someone in that farmhouse headquarters, whether Hausser or von Gersdorf or another staff officer, would have calculated how long remained before the trap closed completely. At the observed rate of Allied advance, perhaps 5 days separated the 7th Army from complete encirclement. Later historical analysis strongly suggests that German commanders understood they had only a few days before the encirclement became complete, though we cannot know with certainty who first spoke those words aloud or how Hausser responded when he heard them. The question that would define the next week must have formed in Hausser's mind during those evening hours. If the gap closed completely before evacuation was complete, how many men would be trapped inside? The answer required counting divisions, adding support elements, estimating stragglers, approximately 50,000 combat personnel, perhaps 60,000 total. That number appears consistently in German military records from this period, a figure that represented not just soldiers, but the fighting heart of Army Group B, the force that had defended Normandy for 2 months against the largest invasion in history. On August 14th, Hausser drafted a formal withdrawal request and sent it up the chain of command to Army Group B, which was still led by Field Marshal von Kluge. The language was stripped of emotion but heavy with military precision. 7th Army situation critical, gap closing rapidly, current lines untenable under continuous air and artillery attack, request immediate authorization to pull the army back toward the dive sector and on to a shorter defensive line. He deliberately avoided dramatic phrasing, knowing that emotional appeals carried little weight at higher headquarters, and instead relied on clear operational facts and time estimates. Reports from subordinate units were already hours old, communications were breaking down under air attack, and movement by daylight had become nearly impossible. The final sentence carried undeniable weight. Without authorization within 24 hours, preservation of fighting strength becomes mathematically impossible. It was not a warning meant to persuade, it was a calculation meant to inform. Later that night, a reply came back from Hitler's headquarters, not from Model, but from Führer headquarters. That alone signaled the problem. Hitler's answer was unambiguous. All units hold current positions and prepare for renewed offensive action. Even as the situation around Falaise tightened, withdrawal not authorized, maintain defensive line, expect reinforcement. The order repeated familiar phrases that had appeared many times before, promising forces that did not exist and time that had already run out. No reference was made to the closing Allied pincers or the air situation. The message reflected confidence, certainty, and absolute detachment from the battlefield reality faced by the Seventh Army. The strategic absurdity of this order would have been immediately apparent to any officer studying the map. Hitler was ordering a counterattack westward toward the coast, while Allied pincers closed around the army from north and south. Roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles, fuel was scarce, and Allied fighter bombers dominated the sky. Units that existed on paper were already shattered in reality. The Führer commanded offensive operations while his army faced encirclement. The disconnect between Hitler's perception in Berlin and reality on the ground near Falaise was so vast it bordered on incomprehensible, even by the standards of late-war German command decisions. Hausser knew what happened to commanders who disobeyed Hitler's direct orders. The Wehrmacht held numerous examples: officers relieved from command, court-martialed, in some cases executed for military failure. Loyalty had increasingly replaced competence as the defining measure of command. The definition of failure had grown broader as the war turned against Germany, absorbing even those who tried to save their troops. Disobeying Hitler carried extreme personal risk, but obeying these particular orders would guarantee something worse: the destruction of an entire army and the loss of any remaining operational flexibility. Records suggest Hausser met with von Gersdorff that night to calculate potential losses if the pocket was sealed completely. The discussion was cold, methodical, and brutally honest. Von Gersdorff's assessment appears in post-war accounts. Staff estimates suggested that several corps and multiple battered divisions were still inside the pocket, adding up to tens of thousands of men when support and rear units were included, plus supply elements, medical personnel, rear area units, and remnants of 5th Panzer Army elements. These were not abstract numbers, but exhausted formations already under constant pressure. The total approached 60,000 men if all categories were included, many wounded, many without heavy weapons, and all dependent on a shrinking corridor. Historical accounts suggest someone in that room asked the critical question: if the gap closes before evacuation completes, will all 50,000 men be trapped? The question cut through rank and protocol. The answer appears in military records and post-war testimonies: yes, all of them. There would be no organized breakout, no relief force, and no second chance. Once sealed, the pocket would become a killing ground dominated by artillery, air power, and chaos. That calculation defined the stakes. In 4 days, Hitler's refusal had transformed a manageable tactical defeat into a strategic catastrophe, threatening to destroy the fighting strength of Army Group B. What could have been an orderly withdrawal had become a race against time under fire. The Seventh Army stood on the edge of annihilation, and the only man who seemed unable to grasp that reality was the one whose authorization was required to prevent it. Morning reports on August 15th showed deterioration accelerating beyond Hausser's worst projections. The gap had continued to narrow rapidly, shrinking from roughly 25 kilometers to about 20 kilometers as Allied forces pressed forward from both north and south. Overnight losses were catastrophic. Allied air attacks inflicted heavy losses overnight, destroying and disabling large numbers of German vehicles and making movement along the roads extremely dangerous by dawn. Panzer elements reported fuel shortages not from depot unavailability, but because supply trucks couldn't reach forward units without being destroyed. Infantry divisions from the 84th and 353rd were losing cohesion as roads choked with burning wreckage and abandoned equipment. At 1000 hours on August 15th, Hausser began issuing orders using language every German officer would recognize, while technically avoiding direct violation of Hitler's command. He ordered divisions to adjust defensive positions eastward to consolidate the line. He authorized tactical repositioning of heavy equipment that cannot be adequately defended. He instructed commanders to conduct mobile rearguard operations to maintain corridor integrity and preserve force. These were not retreat orders by strict definition. They were defensive adjustments, tactical repositioning, and mobile operations. But every officer reading them understood their actual meaning. Begin withdrawing immediately, salvage salvageable equipment, extract your men before the trap closes completely. Hausser gambled that by August 21st or 22nd, when Hitler finally recognized the pocket was sealed, enough evacuation would be complete that salvaging significant 7th Army portions might remain possible. It was a calculated bet that partial evacuation exceeded no evacuation, that saving 20 or 30,000 men was preferable to losing all 50,000, and that disobeying Hitler's order might be forgiven if sufficient army strength survived to continue fighting. The personal risk was enormous. If Hitler discovered unauthorized withdrawal before the pocket was sealed, Hausser faced immediate relief from command, court-martial for disobedience, possibly execution. If evacuation failed, despite his efforts, he would bear blame for both losing the army and violating orders. The only scenario offering professional and personal survival was if enough men escaped to convince Hitler losses were unavoidable, rather than results of unauthorized retreat. Post-war accounts suggest Hausser spent approximately 15 minutes alone after issuing repositioning orders. When he emerged, witnesses reportedly described his face as emotionless, but his hands steady and voice clear. Whatever internal struggle occurred in those minutes had been resolved. Hausser had committed completely to his chosen course. His orders were carefully worded to provide plausible deniability. Language spoke of consolidating defensive positions rather than withdrawal, preserving combat effectiveness rather than retreat, mobile rearguard operations rather than evacuation. This phrasing offered protection if Hitler demanded explanations before pocket closure. Hausser could claim following the spirit of Hitler's orders by preserving 7th Army fighting strength rather than allowing destruction in fixed positions. By the evening of August 15th, updated situation maps showed that the gap had narrowed even further, increasing the urgency of any remaining escape. American forces held their positions around Argentan under existing orders, while patrols and limited advances encountered scattered and disorganized German resistance. Canadian forces pushed to the northern approaches of Falaise, preparing for the assault that would carry them into the town the following day. The Polish 1st Armored Division continued moving south from the north, positioning itself for the later drive toward Chambois that would help close the encirclement. Records suggest Hausser asked von Gersdorf that evening how many would be trapped if the gap closed before evacuation was completed. The answer remained consistent with earlier calculations, approximately 50,000 combat personnel, perhaps 60,000 total. But now the window for saving them was measured in hours rather than days. Everything changed on August 16th, but the change came too late. On August 19th, just after noon, Polish forces reached and seized Hill 262, Mont Ormel, the high ground overlooking the escape routes near Chambois, high ground overlooking escape routes between Troon and Chambois. Once the Poles held Hill 262 on August 19th, their observers and guns could hit the columns below, and daylight movement through that area became extremely dangerous. And its capture made daylight movement through that corridor section nearly suicidal. Later on August 16th, Hitler finally agreed that the armies had to pull back, but the decision came late, and the situation on the roads was already collapsing. Preserve maximum combat strength. The authorization Hausser requested August 14th arrived August 16th. Over the next 2 days, the escape corridor narrowed fast, and every hour made the routes more exposed to artillery and air attack. By Hausser's calculations, perhaps 72 hours remained before Allies completed encirclement, assuming advance rates didn't accelerate, which they almost certainly would as Allied commanders sensed victory approaching. Hausser immediately issued formal evacuation orders backed by Berlin's authorization. German armored elements, including formations from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, were used to hold parts of the escape route and to punch temporary gaps when the corridor began to close. The 116th Panzer Division would hold the southern flank. Their mission: keep the corridor open while infantry divisions moved east. The 276th, 353rd, 84th Infantry, and fragments of a dozen other units began streaming toward the gap. The escape routes had become killing grounds. The N158 through Troon, D16 through Chambois, and farm tracks between them absorbed Allied fighter attacks every 30 minutes. German vehicles crawled forward at walking speed, often in complete darkness, avoiding air attack. Units abandoned fuel trucks when tanks emptied. Ammunition stayed behind when roads became impassable. Officers made independent surrender decisions based on specific unit circumstances. By 0600 August 17th, reports arrived of units surrendering rather than continuing the gauntlet. By August 17th, some units began to surrender in small groups, especially when they ran out of ammunition or lost their routes, and many officers chose capture over a hopeless march under fire. Officers chose surrender over watching men slaughtered on exposed roads. Hausser noted each report, but records suggest he offered no criticism. Under those circumstances, he reportedly could not blame them. By 1800 at August 17th, updated maps showed the gap narrowed to 15 kilometers. Polish and Canadian forces converged from north and south with increasing coordination. American forces pushed north with relentless pressure. The corridor had transformed from gap to defined box with Allied artillery covering 3 sides. Records indicate Hausser had not slept by 0400 August 18th. Night reports showed escalating chaos. Artillery destroyed road junctions, bridges over the Dives River were captured or demolished, units scattered, navigating by darkness while losing contact with parent formations. The gap measured 12 kilometers. By noon, August 18th, the gap stretched just 8 kilometers wide. Hausser's calculations suggested the pocket would seal within 24 to 36 hours at current Allied advance rates. He estimated perhaps 30,000 of his original 50,000 men had escaped or were escaping, meaning approximately 20,000 remained inside, with time evaporating. Post-war descriptions suggest Hausser aged years in hours during those final days. Uniform perpetually dusty from moving between command posts, face drawn from sleep deprivation, voice hoarse from constant orders, but mind sharp and decisions clear. Every hour's delay meant hundreds more casualties. Every fallen road junction meant another closed route. Every fuel-empty tank meant another piece of irreplaceable equipment lost. By 2200 August 19th, the gap had compressed to 3 kilometers wide, fewer than 12,000 feet. By late August 19th, the remaining opening near Chambois and Saint-Lambert had become extremely narrow, with Polish positions on Mont-Ormel pressuring the route while American and French forces closed in from the south. The gap that 6 days earlier stretched 25 kilometers wide, enough to contain armies, had compressed to a small town's width and its surrounding farmland. Hausser positioned himself near Chambois, observing final evacuation that night. The scene was illuminated by tracer fire and artillery flashes. The sky glowed orange and red from burning vehicles. Explosions echoed across farmland every few seconds. Roads packed with men moving on foot. Most had abandoned vehicles kilometers behind where they burned or sat empty of fuel. The defensive perimeter held but barely. The 2nd SS Panzer Division on the western edge engaged in desperate fighting, holding off Polish counterattacks from Hill 262. The 116th Panzer defended southern approaches against American armor. Their orders were brutal in simplicity. Hold 12 more hours so infantry can escape. At 2300 August 19th, a runner reached Hausser with information forcing his final decision. Polish forces were holding Hill 262 under heavy attack from German units advancing from multiple directions, and their artillery and machine guns dominated the surrounding escape routes. The 2nd SS Panzer Division reported that its positions were close to collapse, and that continued resistance could only be maintained for a very limited time. After that, Hill 262 would fall, and Polish artillery would command direct fire on every remaining corridor meter. According to later accounts, Hausser made his final decision late in the evening as the situation around the corridor rapidly deteriorated. He would lead headquarters staff through the gap immediately. The column consisted of approximately 2,000 men, walking wounded who couldn't maintain unit pace, communication specialists carrying radio equipment, senior staff officers with intelligence documents, and command staff itself. Hausser had deliberately delayed his evacuation until certain combat formations had either escaped or were irretrievably trapped. Now, with the remaining corridor extremely narrow and shrinking as Allied forces tightened their grip from both sides, the escape window was nearly closed. Shortly after midnight on August 20th, Hausser led his headquarters column through the Chambois area under intense fire. Historical accounts describe the experience as unlike anything these veterans had encountered, even after years on the Eastern Front. Polish machine gun fire came from Hill 262 north, muzzle flashes visible against the dark sky. American artillery struck roads from south, shells screaming overhead before exploding. Night sky lit with tracer rounds and burning vehicles casting everything in hellish orange light. Men fell, some killed instantly, others wounded and unable to continue, calling for help that couldn't come because stopping meant death for everyone. The column kept moving, stepping over bodies and around craters, following roads east toward safety that lay 3 kilometers away, but might as well have been 300 given the fire they walked through. Somewhere in that passage between Chambois and safety, shell fragments struck Hausser's jaw. Historical records confirm the wounds were serious, metal splinters embedded in the jawbone. Medical officers later confirmed that Hausser had suffered a serious jaw wound, and that his survival owed much to chance and rapid movement through the corridor, which would have meant death within minutes. Hausser kept moving, uniform torn from crawling through debris, blood running down his neck. But reports suggest he refused to stop until the column cleared the corridor. By 02:15 August 20th, Hausser's column had broken through. Post-war accounts suggest he turned looking back at what remained of the Falaise Pocket. Tracer fire still lit the sky above the encircled position. Explosions still echoed. Thousands remained trapped inside, still attempting breakthroughs or hiding in woods waiting for escape opportunities that would never come. Historical testimonies suggest Hausser stood several minutes looking back toward the pocket, his expression reportedly showing something that might have been relief or grief or both. His decision to allow earlier withdrawals may have contributed to the escape of tens of thousands of German troops, although the exact number remains uncertain and depended on many factors beyond his control, but 30 to 35,000 remained behind. For a commander, those numbers would never balance. By the morning of August 20th, Canadian and Polish forces had linked up around Chambois, and although small gaps remained contested, the encirclement was close to final closure. The corridor that measured 25 kilometers, August 14th, 18 kilometers, August 16th, 3 kilometers, August 19th, now measured 0. The trap had closed. Everyone still inside was either dead or would soon be captured. After the pocket was sealed, Allied units began estimating the results, and most accounts suggest that roughly 10,000 to 15,000 Germans were killed, about 40,000 to 50,000 were taken prisoner, and somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 escaped, usually without heavy weapons. The capture of tens of thousands of German soldiers was one of the biggest mass surrenders in Western Europe, but it was not the largest since Stalingrad, because the Axis surrender in Tunisia in May 1943 was far larger. Unlike Stalingrad, where trapped forces fought months in an urban environment, the pocket formed and tightened over several days in mid-August, and by the time it was finally sealed on August 21st, most heavy equipment had been lost. The speed of encirclement and completeness of destruction shocked even Allied commanders who planned the operation. Material losses exceeded personnel casualties in terms of Germany's war continuation ability. Canadian reports from the northern sector counted about 344 tanks and self-propelled guns, along with roughly 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles and 252 guns, destroyed or abandoned after the battle, irreplaceable Panthers. Germany never learned to manufacture efficiently enough to replace combat losses. Panzer IVs that had served since 1939, but now ceased to exist. Armored formations that escaped were badly crippled, and later reports show that the surviving German armored divisions came out with only a small fraction of their tanks still operational. Beyond tanks, 7th Army lost 2,447 soft-skin vehicles, supply trucks, fuel trucks, medical vehicles, and communication vans. 252 artillery pieces were lost, weapons requiring months to manufacture and trained crews to operate. Horses numbering thousands were killed, drowned, or abandoned, and while horses seemed insignificant compared to tanks, the German army still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport for supply movement. The 7th Army that had defended Normandy for 2 months no longer existed as a combat unit. It had been atomized, scattered across French farmland in burning vehicles and unmarked graves. The 12th SS Panzer Division HlTLER entered the Normandy campaign with about 20,540 men, and by late August it had suffered heavy losses, with many accounts putting its remaining strength at roughly 12,000. The HlTLER Division lost its commanding officer, nearly all company commanders, all tank company commanders, most experienced non-commissioned officers. What remained wasn't a division in a meaningful sense. It was a collection of military refugees in uniform, men without organization, leadership, or equipment, survivors requiring months of reconstitution before functioning as a combat unit again. Several days after escape, Hausser sat in a farmhouse 30 kilometers east of Falaise, jaw aching from shrapnel wounds. Post-war accounts suggest he asked von Gersdorff the question that would haunt his remaining life. If withdrawal authorization had arrived August 12th when first requested, how many could have been saved? Several days later, Hausser, still suffering from his jaw wound, reportedly asked his staff a question that would linger. If the withdrawal had been approved earlier, how many more men might have escaped? And most careful accounts answer only in estimates. Many tens of thousands, not a single certain number, possibly more. They would have had time moving heavy equipment in organized columns. Divisional organizations and command structures could have been preserved. Trained staff officers and technical specialists could have survived. The 7th Army would have remained a functioning military formation. A few days of delay made the difference, because each day the corridor narrowed and the road network collapsed under air attack and artillery fire. The period Hitler spent refusing withdrawal authorization, while Allies relentlessly closed an inescapable trap. Those 4 days transformed an absorbable tactical defeat into a strategic catastrophe, crippling German defensive capabilities in France. The general who spent 8 days watching his army die on French roads learned lessons that would define warfare for generations. Control the skies, control the roads, control the supplies, and you control everything beneath. The German 7th Army possessed experienced commanders, veteran troops, quality equipment, and tactical skill. None of those advantages mattered once Allies established complete air superiority over the battlefield and deployed overwhelming artillery covering every escape route. Allied fighter bombers flew large numbers of sorties each day, and they struck German movement again and again throughout daylight hours, so the Luftwaffe could rarely interfere in a meaningful way. German forces had no effective counter. The Luftwaffe that had dominated European skies in 1940 was virtually absent from Normandy in 1944, and that absence proved decisive. Artillery fire from Allied batteries rained continuously on congested roads. German forces moving through the corridor had no way to suppress or avoid those guns. The systematic nature of destruction, not random chaos but methodical, sustained, overwhelming firepower, demonstrated warfare's evolution since war's beginning. This wasn't the lightning war of 1940, where German forces swept across France in 6 weeks. This was industrial warfare, where the side with more factories, more resources, more air-ground coordination could grind down even skilled opponents through sheer material weight. Hitler's responsibility for the disaster remains debated by historians, but basic facts are undeniable. August 12th, when competent military judgment dictated immediate withdrawal, Hitler ordered 7th Army to hold and prepare counterattacks. As the Allies pressed in during mid-August, German commanders repeatedly urged withdrawal, but Hitler resisted for days, and he continued to demand that the front be held as long as possible. On August 16th, Hitler finally allowed a withdrawal from Normandy, but Polish forces did not seize and hold Hill 262 until August 19th, and by then the escape route was already under deadly observation and fire. But by then the organized evacuation window had closed. What followed wasn't withdrawal, but desperate flight through a killing zone. Hausser's decision to issue tactical repositioning orders on August 15th raised fundamental command structure questions remaining relevant today. What is a commander's obligation when receiving orders he knows will produce catastrophic losses? Does duty require blind obedience to supreme command, or does duty require force preservation when higher authority operates from flawed intelligence? Had Hausser completely obeyed Hitler's orders, the entire 7th Army might have been destroyed or captured. By carefully and deliberately disobeying those orders, Hausser saved perhaps 25,000 men. But he also accepted personal responsibility for violating military discipline in wartime. History largely vindicated Hausser's decision. He was not court-martialed or executed after the battle, and while Hitler's later withdrawal order may have reduced the focus on earlier disputes, the larger collapse in Normandy also made it hard to assign blame to one commander alone, partly because disaster scale overwhelmed individual responsibility questions, partly because Germany desperately needed experienced commanders and couldn't afford eliminating them for battlefield decisions. Hausser recovered from his wound and returned to command duties later in the war, and he went on to lead major formations on the Western Front as the fighting shifted toward the Rhine and into Germany. He survived the war to write about his experiences and defend his Falaise actions. The Falaise Pocket wasn't just a German defeat, but a demonstration of that defeat's systematic nature. Allied industrial production's overwhelming weight, air-ground force integration, Allied intelligence and communication system superiority, numerical troop and equipment advantages, all combined creating situations where German tactical skill and fighting spirit simply couldn't prevent disaster. What Falaise demonstrated conclusively was that by August 1944, the industrial and technological gap between Germany and Allies had grown too wide to bridge through superior tactics or brave soldiers. Germany could still win individual battles, but Allies could afford to absorb those tactical defeats and continue advancing because they possessed resources Germany could no longer match. The general who disobeyed Hitler lived, knowing that his actions helped allow tens of thousands of men to escape, while many others did not, lived with the knowledge that 30,000 others hadn't escaped. That calculation would never balance, not on any moral or emotional scale. He made the right decision by any reasonable military standard. Partial evacuation clearly exceeded complete annihilation. But command decision mathematics operate differently than tactical planning mathematics because they are measured in human lives rather than abstract outcomes. A commander saving 20,000 while losing 30,000 has still presided over the destruction of a major military formation. That responsibility's psychological weight does not diminish with time. If anything, reflection only sharpens it. The faces of men who made it through the Chambois Gap, exhausted, wounded, but alive, were matched by faces Hausser could only imagine of those who did not escape, who died on burning roads or surrendered when resistance became impossible, leaving no memory to soften the loss. The question haunting Hausser for the rest of his life, how many could we have saved if Hitler had authorized withdrawal on August 12th, became one of World War II's great what-if questions, because it exposed how delay itself can function as a weapon. Some post-war estimates suggested that many more men might have escaped if withdrawal had been approved earlier, but no single figure can be stated with certainty. Several days of delay dramatically increased losses, turning a difficult withdrawal into a catastrophe that destroyed much of the Seventh Army. Those casualties brought no strategic advantage, no tactical position, and no meaningful time. They were expended for no military purpose beyond Hitler's refusal to acknowledge the situation. The Falaise Pocket became a military education case study for generations, examined not only as a tactical battle, but as a warning about rigid command under ideological pressure. It is studied as an example of tension between supreme authority and field command, between political leadership and military judgment, and between obedience and responsibility. Hausser's gradual decision to allow unauthorized withdrawals in mid-August became a template for debates about independent judgment under extreme pressure, even at personal risk. His decision's consequences, both the 25,000 who escaped and the 30,000 who did not, remain evidence weighed carefully, not comfortably, by historians and professional officers alike. In the end, Hausser's Falaise legacy rests on a simple but profound reality. He made an impossible choice under catastrophic circumstances, fully aware that every option carried disaster. He chose to save as many men as possible rather than follow orders he knew would guarantee his army's complete destruction. Whether that decision was legally justified, morally correct, or militarily sound continues to be debated, but the fundamental fact remains undeniable. The general who disobeyed Hitler saved 20,000 men who would otherwise have joined 50,000 trapped in the Falaise Pocket when Allied forces finally sealed the pocket around Chambois in late August 1944. Those men lived, fought in other battles, defended other positions, and eventually returned home to their families when the war ended. Their survival was the direct result of one general's willingness to risk everything, career, reputation, and possibly his life, on a decision he believed was right, even though it violated direct orders from the Supreme Commander. That is the weight of command, measured not in medals or promotions, but in the faces of men who lived because one officer chose responsibility to his soldiers over obedience to orders he knew were wrong, and then lived the rest of his life with that knowledge. If you found this story of command, courage, and impossible decisions compelling, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history's greatest battles. We bring you the human stories behind the history books, the moments when individual choices changed the course of nations. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss another episode of history brought to life.